It is such an honor to have you on this podcast, and thank you for joining me, Richard. Uh, when I heard your delivery of your inaugural address for Obama, when you read your poem, the inaugural poem you read, I felt so close to you because my work is called the mosaic. And when you think about all the pieces of a mosaic coming together to create one piece of art, the beauty of what I saw in your poetry was that you were talking about this one world that we all live in, no matter how diverse we are. What is the biggest message that you really want to communicate to the world today?
Well, I mean, in particular relation in as regards to that poem, that's exactly right. It was sort of like just taking us on the journey of one day of how we're all, whether we're conscious of that or aware of that or not, that we're all interconnected. And I think that's the kind of the message of the poem and the larger message of, I guess, my work. This idea, there's the idea of dependence, there's the idea of independence, but the highest sort of form of being is knowing that we're all interdependent. According to Buddhist philosophy, this idea that even though you may not recognize it, that we're all in this together. And so that's kind of where the poem takes its cue from. In the context, of course, of what does it mean to be an American, right? Because we're so diverse and so from so many different. It's a huge country, right? But in some ways, we're all interconnected, or we should be at least.
Well, I think the beauty of what I loved about your work and what you say is that we don't even need to understand that we are all interconnected, but we are all interconnected. And when we then wake up to the fact that what we do affects everything about what we do because we are interconnected, why I like the image of a mosaic so much is that very rarely are pieces connected side to side. Sometimes it's just corner to corner. And sometimes most of what this person thinks and what this person thinks don't agree. But it's just this tiny little corner of connection that makes the whole mosaic work. And so let's go back a little bit. I know you grew up in 3 different countries, so to speak. But what did your parents do?
What did my parents do?
Yeah.
Yeah, my dad was actually a naval cadet in Cuba, and he was studying, not studying, but he was becoming a port pilot, which is a really interesting job. Which is the captain of the ship doesn't bring in the ship to the port. It's the port captain who knows the port, and so they're the ones who bring the ships in and out of their ports. So, and my mother was a teacher, elementary school teacher. However, all that changed because of when they immigrated and their exile, and also because of the language barrier. So my dad ended up becoming a bookkeeper by trade that he learned from my grandfather, who also learned it by trade. He's been on his own since he was 13. And my mother ended up becoming a bank teller, of all things. Wow. So, yeah, they had to shift a lot of what they did just to survive. And the language barrier was a big problem with that.
Yeah, I'm always shocked at how much I went to seminary for 5 years, and I was one day away from becoming a rabbi. And you read a story in the Bible, the Tower of Babel, and you think, oh, what sort of curse is that? But the fact that we speak so many multiple languages and we can't understand each other, it makes it even harder to be heard in a world that doesn't really hear us anyway. And so I'm intrigued by, when you grew up like that, with what influence did the fact that your parents were second language English speaking have on you?
Well, a couple of things. They learned English more or less, but they were terrified and embarrassed to speak it. And then growing up in Miami, you don't really need to know English as much. You do, but it's not a thing that you need every day, because most, the clientele at the bank mostly spoke Spanish. Your co-workers speak Spanish. So they got away with, unfortunately, that's the bad side of it, that they never really solidified their Spanish, and their English. But rather, I just remember as a little kid, I don't remember ever having one language. I always had two languages. I got to the United States when I was 45 days old. Because we're a working class family, I was already in daycare probably like by 2 years old.
Yeah.
And I started learning English from my little friend Jay, who was who was my buddy at daycare. So I don't ever remember not knowing two languages. And I remember translating from my parents at a very young age. I mean, not whole conversations, but just, how do you say this? How do you say that?
Yeah.
And then also knowing there was a kind of linguistic power that I held over my parents. Eventually, once we leave the Miami-Dade County line, like they were at our mercy linguistically. By we, I mean my brother and myself.
Yeah.
But also, I've recently actually I've been thinking to myself, Richard, why the hell did you become a poet of all things? I mean, I'm an
Yes.
engineer. Where does this, we weren't a literary family. We had no books at home. I don't have an early childhood memory of writing poems or anything like that. And I trace it back to actually recently, I just realized that I trace it back to that I learned at a very young age that language was not just a form of communication. It was also a way of living, of thinking, of breathing, of being in the world. And
Yeah.
I think it imprinted in me the power of language and a fascination with language. So I think that's actually ultimately where I trace my urge to write poetry from.
Fabulous. And were you encouraged in that growing up, or were you when you decided that I'm going to be a poet? In the world today, poetry, like I was in publishing for a lot of years, and poetry was the one thing we said we can't publish because it just doesn't sell. How did that happen for you?
Well, again, it's all in the context of like my culture and my class. So, like I said, we didn't have any books at home. My parents were, just trying to survive. We didn't talk about Picasso at the dinner table. There was no sense of the arts as anything really tangible. Adding to that, what little my parents could understand about art or poetry or literature or music had to deal with Cuba. So my parents didn't even know who like the Rolling Stones were.
Wow.
They had no concept of even popular American culture, much less Robert Frost or anything like that. So that was kind of outside of the realm of anything that I grew up with. And then there was another factor. My grandmother who was my primary caretaker and lived with us. My grandmother was also very homophobic. So, the idea of even studying painting or literature or something was just way too queer for her. So, I wanted to study architecture at one time, and even that was too gay for her. So, so all those factors led me to. I studied engineering, and I've been a practicing civil engineer all my life. It was. I gotta say, I was always a left brain, right brain kind of kid. I still love everything, and I was really good at math. I was better at math than at English, actually. And so I loved my engineering, and it was actually during my career as an engineer that I discovered poetry. Because my writing, my job as an engineer, about half of it was writing studies, proposals, letters, all these kinds of things. Almost every human endeavor comes down to language and communication.
Yeah.
And so my right brain creative side, which was never really able to express itself, suddenly started really geeking out on language and really thinking about language. And then I just started writing poetry like at 26.
Wow.
So it wasn't this kind of, it wasn't quite an aha moment either. I was just following a creative curiosity. At that point, I had already my career, so I just thought I'm just going to do this because I want to. It was to treat myself, to learn something and explore something that I would never had the chance to do. And as luck would have it, sometimes that's the best way to approach anything in life.
I love
Is
that.
just kind of do it full heartedly with dedication, but without it, I had no expectations and I had no my ego wasn't involved. And so
Yeah.
really, and I went to graduate school eventually in creative writing while I worked full time as an engineer, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah, totally. So I want to dive down a little bit in that, because I bet there are a lot of people that are listening that grew up in a family that said what they wanted to do they couldn't do, or that, I mean, you had it really even worse, because they sort of judged it and called it homophobic, and that this was not something, you were going to be gay if you did that. They're not even knowing that you probably were already knew that you were gay from that
Right.
moment. But right, but there's so many people that are told what's right for them to do and what's wrong for them to do and what they can't do, and you still went into engineering because you wanted to somehow please or do whatever it was you wanted to do. I mean, I'm interested to know how, but then you came back to what you wanted without. What gave you the strength to just say, I'm just going to do this for me? Like, whether it ever gets heard, accepted, or that anybody ever hears a line of poetry I write or not, I'm going to write because I just want to write. What gave you that strength?
Well, I mean, I don't know. And, it's not quite, I wouldn't say it's quite that dramatic. I think that, I love engineering, and I mean, it's not that my parents didn't let me, it's just that there was no realm of possibility. It wasn't even something that I even knew could be done. Like, so I didn't know till I was later in life that was even, like, writing poetry was even a thing, right? Um,
Yeah.
but, as they say, most of the things in life that happen are everything that happens between what you plan,
Yeah.
as they say. But also, it's just baby steps. It wasn't like the clouds parted and, I'm going to be a poet. I just was, following, sort of just exploring and following my creative curiosity, baby steps, and taking one step at a time. And like we do with everything in life. And slowly you build not only courage, but a passion, and you build, like, a kind of vision for yourself. But I think it's a mistake to, sometimes, to say, "Oh, I'm going to do this," and then, that's the ego talking, right? It's like, no,
Yes.
well, you maybe I'll write poetry now. Let me go take a class. Let's see what this is about.
Right.
So if you would have told me at 24 that I was going to be a poet, I would have laughed in your face.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there I was at 26 in graduate school, and getting my MFA in creative writing. So, it's more like courage in the sense of, courage, which is interesting. In Spanish, courage comes from corazón. It's heart, right? Like, and so it's more that kind of courage. It's just following your heart kind of courage. And
But you,
again,
excuse me for jumping in. You say that so matter of factly, but so often it's so hard for people to just have the courage to follow their heart. I work with a
yeah,
lot of people, right? And it's like, and I love the way you just, like, let it float through, right? As if, hey, it just comes down to following your heart, and you do what you love to do. But there's so many people that are caught in this world where I can't do what I love to do, because I don't believe that's going to do anything for me. But you just somehow floated into it, and you didn't just float into it to be a poet that inconsequential. There are very few. You're one of five, poets that
right.
spoke at the inauguration of a president, and so, like, what. And I don't want to get caught into, like, how that happened, but I just, like, what was it that you believed in so much that you knew that might come, or you didn't? How did that happen for you?
Um, you just, again, you show up, and you keep on showing up, and you have failures and you have successes, and you just keep on showing up. And not that I haven't had my crisis moments either, where sometimes, I think after my third book, I was just like, well, why am I really doing this?
Yeah.
And then, I found a new sense of purpose in my poetry. But ultimately, why, I guess what keeps me writing poetry is that I feel like I'm participating in the world. I'm active. I'm actively exploring and questioning my life, the world around me, the people around me. And every time I write a poem, at the end of the day, I always feel like I discovered something new, in various contexts, whether it's about something deeply personal, or something new about a memory I didn't realize what that was, or whether it's something new about the world, or, so that constant sort of investigating the world, it's like kind of what kept me going for years.
Fabulous.
And Again, not without, moments of self-doubt
So can you take a moment and dive into that self-doubt? Because in the world of literature, poetry, if you walk into bookstores, poetry sections are small. You know, it's not, and publishing, from my own experience in the publishing world, publishers say, well, poetry just doesn't sell. How are you ever going to do that? What was those moments of crisis for you, and what gave you the courage to go through those moments of crisis and continue
Sure.
going?
So I got to say, I had like, because I was in the beginning, I was just like, sort of, this is just something I'm doing, but I didn't have any expectations, or
Yeah.
I had expectations, but my ego wasn't as wrapped up in it. So my first book, where I wrote at lunch hour. I mean, it was my MFA thesis was published before I graduated, and then the ego set in, and I was like, okay, now I'm a published poet. And then I
Right.
took a break from engineering and started teaching creative writing and full time, and I was like, I am a poet. And then the ego started believing all that jazz and thinking I knew how to write a poem. I've arrived, you know, like, and so that caused a lot of bad work to happen, because it was being driven not from the heart, but it was driven by ego, by the mind. And so my second book was really torturous. It was like 4 years of white knuckling and masterminding, and essentially I was writing this new masterpiece that was going to win the Pulitzer Prize. And of course the book was horrible, and then I realized that I had been writing all these other poems that didn't belong in the book, and that was actually the book that I had been writing
Wow.
subconsciously. So that kind of pulled me out of, but that was a real low. I was like, you know, if it's hard to publish a first book of poetry, it's twice as hard to publish a second book of poetry,
Yes.
because there aren't even that many opportunities. For the third book, I said, I'm not going to do that again. This is, you know, I can't approach my art from that space anymore. And I just started trusting myself a little bit more, trusting that what I was writing was eventually going to make sense in terms of the book, that it was all sort of, that trusting my subconscious, trusting my path. And so the third book was kind of an easier thing, got published pretty easily. And then after that, I went through another moment where I was like, well, why am I doing this? Like, there's just like,
Yeah.
nobody's waiting for my fourth book of poetry. um, or at least I felt that way. And you know, I guess all artists have sort of a healthy kind of skepticism about their careers and their work. And I think that's part of life. You have to question things sometimes. And so I just sort of reevaluated and recommitted myself to the art, and saying, you know what, I love doing this. I love the company of poets. If anything has a chance to be a legacy for me, and if I have any chance at leaving some kind of legacy, it's in my writing. I'm not going to build the Golden Gate Bridge. Um, and so I just kind of went back almost not completely to that innocence, because you can't really recapture that innocence exactly, but sort of went back to how I started writing, why why I began to write in the first place, and try to be in that sort of space. And I don't know if that had something to do with the next great leap, which was when the White House called. And it was, you know, it was just sort of an energetic kind of saying, you know, showing up, I'm here, I'm present, I surrender. I have my heart in this. But like you said, if there's applause, there's applause. If there's no, I'm not going to do it just for that.
Yeah.
And so, but now I have gone through another phase now too, which is now you reach this sort of this great, I mean, peak of like notoriety
Yeah,
and
totally.
exposure of the work. And now the ego gets back involved. It's like, well, you know, do I even deserve that? You know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
moments of self-doubt, like thinking like, oh my God, can I keep this up? And now I'm more afraid to publish, because, like, you know, I have a thousand eyes watching, you know, what I
Yeah.
do. So like,
Yeah.
I'm like, I can't, I'm hesitant to publish an okay poem, or like, I'm
Yeah.
like, set a new standard. So no matter what you achieve, there's always, and I think it's, again, healthy. It's like just sort of in a way saying, well, this is not it. You know, I'm going to keep on working. I'm going to keep on. What's the next thing? What's the, as they say in improv, which life is kind of an improv session. It's like when something happens, you in your mind you say yes,
Yeah.
and
Yes,
and you
I love
continue.
it. I love it.
And
So I'm really intrigued, and I'm really intrigued, and I want to be sensitive to time because I have one question that I will always close with that I want to ask. But before I do that, I'm just really intrigued by this sort of, first of all, your honesty, and thank you so much for being as honest as you are, because to be a person that is known as well as you are and to be this honest and vulnerable is also a beautiful quality. I know so many people that don't have the courage to be this honest and vulnerable, and I appreciate that.
Sure.
But I'm very intrigued by this seemingly battle that I see going on that you seem to speak of.
I'm sorry.
No,
Got a little frog in my throat there.
that's all right. This sort of battle that seems to go on between this really simple, beautiful person that just wrote for the sheer joy of writing, and then the egoic part of you that took over and said, well, now I'm a published author and now I have to do this, and how the work then didn't get good, and you weren't as happy with that work. So then the notoriety and all of the mind games that go on with your own being as you, the same person, change from what people think of you to what you actually are. Can you just dive 1 minute into that? And because I think there's so many people that are caught in that same place, that they have a love of something and an innocence of something, and it propels them to go forward. And the love and courage of their heart allows them to start something. And then they think, oh, but now I need to be this person. I watched it in publishing. We brought authors that were amazing people, and then people started to tell them how great they were, and they became the biggest assholes they ever would imagine. Right? Because they only wanted green M&Ms, but they were the most beautiful people before. And I would sit with them and say, what happened to the person that I first met? Where is that guy? So what is it in the human psyche that makes us say, wow, now I'm somebody and I have to respond to these people that are waiting for my next words?
Yeah, I think that's I love, I'm sort of an amateur psychologist. I love reading all kinds of spiritual books, and into therapy for God knows. It's like my going to church for me. I mean, what I've seen over and over again in myself, it's ultimately, this battle with the ego. The ego is the one that wants to be perfect. The ego is the one who gets mad, who thinks you're perfect, and also knows and says at the same time, you stink, you're horrible, you're fake, you're never going to be able to do this again. I think it's just part of the human condition, and it's like, and again, it's every level. So like, here you think, I remember when I published my first book, I went to the bookstore, and the book was right next to William Blake, Blanco. Blake. I was like, I've done nothing. You're a loser. What a compliment! You have one book of poetry. So I think it's always just to keep tabs on that. I think it's, you're right. These reactions, I think, are really egoic reactions, out of fear that I'm a fake, out of fear I can't pull this off one more time. And you see that that's kind of the archetypal human trajectory. The dark night of the soul. St. John, you have all these kinds of the hero's journey at Campbell.
Totally.
So the kind of, I think, just recognizing that that's okay, and knowing that, once you recognize the ego, it kind of says, once you call it out, it kind of abates itself for a little while, at least. So I think it's always a constant, just the awareness that is part of the process, because also in some ways there's a healthy kind of skepticism that keeps you working harder too. Like, no, I'm not going to stay here and just, okay, well, I'm not going to be, at 80 years old, I was the fifth inaugural poet, and telling my little war stories about meeting Obama. I mean, that's all fine and dandy, but I mean, that's why I love artists like, for example, Cher, who's still relevant, because they keep on challenging themselves. And so that's the thing. It's always keep on challenging, keep on producing, be in the creative space, whatever you are, whether that's a poet or a CEO for a company, always to be on the creative edge of things. Because that's the only time I really feel most alive. And that's the only time where I really feel in harmony, is when I'm working on the creative edge, where everything is sort of the ego is in the right place. You're flowing, you're part of something larger. And that's a beautiful feeling. And it's hard to maintain. You can't walk around like that most of the time. But I would
Yeah,
say just be aware. And I've seen that, I've seen the diva poet moments.
totally, totally. How
Where
could
I'm
you
like,
not?
and I can just tell they're just scared because, what poet, we don't get that much attention. When we do, the ego sometimes doesn't know what to do
Yeah,
with it. It
yeah.
just kind of
No.
overreacts, and like it's really just anxiety and nervousness that gets channeled into like some kind of like arrogance or
There is so much that I wish we had time to talk about, but I want to be I want to be respectful of your time.
sure.
Um, uh, but maybe under another cover, I would love to talk about this mindset that always has to second guess ourselves, always has to say we're not good enough. It's just a fraud. I'm just hiding. I'm an imposter. Versus this mindset that just says, I'm going to let go of all of that. Whatever I am, and people will discover me for whoever I am. So I'm just going to be myself, and I'm not going to worry about if I'm an imposter or not an imposter. I'm going to just show up innocent. I'm going to just show up real. I'm going to just show up and continue to do it. And even if I show up as an asshole, because I'm starting to get like a lot of the authors that I worked with, they just started to become the weirdest people that you ever want to see. They only wanted green M&Ms in the waiting room because they just believed they deserved that and felt entitled to it, and I just looked at them. I said, what happened to you? Like, where did the guy that I met go to? And fortunately, they allowed me that presence to be able to help them get through that stuff. But
Right.
there's something that I think just in life in general, when we let go of all those preconceived notions of what we think we have to be, and just like let it go and just let this new energy of what we have come into ourselves, something miraculous happens. So under another cover, and I would love to continue conversation with you, and just off camera, not necessarily on camera, of just how this whole thing works, and to share with you some of the things that are going on. But let me honor
Well,
your time.
I
Go
can
ahead,
tell
man.
you that partly where that happens for me is in the writing itself,
Yeah,
where you writing writing is in a way for me a spiritual practice, and
of
it's
course.
also where you surrender, and because you realize you have no control over this, right?
Yeah,
Like there's um and so it's a lot of getting into that space is a lot of what they call writer's block, is just because your ego is not allowing you to just be. And so that's part of why I love writing too. You just have to be very present. Another thing is, I try to create that aura or that environment. And part of what I come back to my sort of meditate. I'm not a big meditator, but at least I call it reflection, not
yeah.
meditation, because I'm too much of a spaz to meditate. you know, I think we all have. Like, speaking of Blake said always that the child is the perfect creator, right? And I always close your eyes and you just remember that first moment of consciousness as a little kid, when you finally realize you were a being. And for me, I can go back into that space in a second. And it's that deeper, deeper voice, not the voice that's chattering all day, but that little boy that I remember playing with Legos and just being ever just present in that moment, like of pure creation. That's how I try to get back in that space. That's what I try to do.
Love it.
Um, I think it all depends on personalities too. So,
Yeah.
you know, um, I think we can both say there are plenty of assholes in the world that have never written a book.
Yeah, so
They
absolutely.
still want green M&Ms.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
it's really, it's larger than that. I think when we are exposed or we're part of a public eye, that really gets amped up, right? Our ego just
Yes.
suddenly we're under the watch. But I say two things also when I go read or even when I teach. I say the prayer of Saint Francis, which is, and I'm completely secular, but
Yeah. Yeah.
I love the language of it. It's so beautiful about surrender. Grant me, sort of saying, um, basically that I'm in service to the world. What I get back is not as much as important as what I give and what I'm there to give. The prayer, right? It's
Yeah,
just
totally.
like
Totally.
I don't know
Totally.
by memory,
No, I know
but
100%.
right, that I
And
may
we can even post it.
console rather than be consoled,
Make me
love
an
rather than be
instrument
loved.
of your, yeah.
Yeah. And
Um,
there's a beautiful last line in there. It says, "For it is in the dying that we live forever." And like, it's a religious concept, but what I feel that is if when you let the ego die is when you're really born.
yeah.
And then the other thing I always think of is RuPaul's Drag Race, when uh, when the when the drag queens have to lip sync for their life, and he
Yeah.
tells them, "And don't fuck it up." It's just this idea of I'm surrendering, but also
Don't
give it
fuck it
my
up.
best. Professional. I'm here. I'm not here to just like just be and like
Yeah.
like whatever.
Yeah.
I have a craft. I have something that I've worked very hard at, and I'm gonna do my best. So those two things are uh, kind of things I keep on to keep reminders to myself of getting me back, whether that's in an interview or teaching or just writing.
Yeah. It almost feels so simple because when I listen to you, it's somehow you said it that um, it's a work of the heart. And when you're in your heart, there's a different energy that comes through than when you're in your head. The head wants to impress. The head wants to make sure that it doesn't let down or do something wrong. But the heart just has this innocence that says, "I'm just going to write from that place in my heart," because it doesn't even think about the possibility of letting people down or doing any of that. It just wants to share its love. And so it seems almost so simple, but just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy. Right? It's
Yeah.
just living in your heart. Who has the courage to live in their heart? Is like we were saying
The,
before.
the hardest thing of I think writing of living is getting in that space and that
Totally,
balance between
totally.
um and again, even outside of even in engineering, when I know when I'm in flow in engineering, and it's not because
Yeah,
I'm worried about the client or oh my god this deadline. I'm just like we're gonna sit here and design this bridge 1 foot at a time and see what happens.
that's right. I love it. So this is I'm very much looking forward to your answer to the question. This is the thing that I close every podcast with. When you look out into the world, like you look out your window and you see the world that we live in, is this the world that you always dreamed you would hand over to future generations?
Um, Outside, I don't know. I feel like that's like someone like a parent question, but I don't have kids. But I do feel that I've come I've done what I came here to do,
Yeah,
and still doing it in that sense. So my children and what I leave to the world is my work,
yeah,
and that feels very satisfying, especially when people respond to your work and it makes a difference in their lives because it's not about me anymore. Once I put a poem in the world, it's for everybody else. It's already gone for me. It is like a child in the world. So in that sense, yeah.
yeah.
uh,
So the work of your creation is what you love, but the world that it goes into, is that the world you always dreamed your work would go into? When you look at the world, would you say to people, boy, this world that exists outside my window today is exactly the world I always thought I would I would I would be in or leave to future generations? Or is there something in it you would like to change?
um, I guess it was the worst of times. It was the best of times.
Yeah.
Um, I've there are questions I don't want to say that I've lived behind. The questions that I question about myself is just what is this world I live in and what's happened to it, or what is this mess or what is this beauty? um, I don't think I have control over that. I try to think, I guess on another I try to understand life in really large historical arcs, and that every generation in a way feels, again, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, but I mean, we're obviously going through a really strange period in our history right now, as far as politics are concerned. But '68 wasn't a very good year either.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
neither was like neither was the 1950s. I mean, come on, this is all a fiction in our heads that we create. So, um, in terms of surrender, I don't think I have the power to say that. what I'm leaving behind. The world runs on a much larger consciousness than my own. I mean, all I can say is like, I try to leave behind what I can to make the world a better place in terms of hopefully creating more understanding, more connections, more a greater understanding of interconnectedness, a greater sense of consciousness, and not out of a place of arrogance because I don't have all the answers, but just as a gift of what I've been able to discover and share with the world. But yeah, I always sort of think of the world in it's a much larger place than me.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and I think, you know, I seriously question my own or human agency in general.
Yeah.
I think it's not one person, but it's a collective sense of what really creates history and creates change. And who's in charge of that? I don't think anybody is, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of an evolutionary psychology of our species that sort of is collectively solving and creating and moving together through this world for better or for worse.
I love this podcast for so many reasons, but I love the fact that people who didn't know each other 18 seconds ago can sit and have a conversation that's so real and so open and so vulnerable and really believe very much the same things, that none of us can do any of this on our own. Part of the reason why I wrote a book called The Mosaic, which is a parable. It's a story, but I love the concept of a mosaic, that all these broken pieces on their own are just broken pieces of memories of what used to be. But when
Right.
they come together, they create this incredible artistry that is just compelling to look at. And it's so beautiful that you can't even imagine how it's possible that something so beautiful could be made. But when we come together, we do create something beautiful. It's been the story of our history. It's been the story of the way change has happened in the world. It's by people coming together, no matter what we think. The more diverse, the better, and making
Right.
this beautiful art that we then leave to a world in front of us. So I just want to thank you for the most valuable thing people have is their time. And I want to thank you for spending some of that time with me and
Sure. My pleasure.
honoring me with your thoughts and your work. And we will put your places where people can get in touch with you. But if you want to just say how the best way for people to get in touch with you would be.
They'd be through my website, richard-blanco.com.
Okay.
There's all sorts of emails and addresses and whatnot there, but there's also obviously social media, poet Richard Blanco at Instagram and of course Facebook and all that jazz. But the website has poems there. Poems has audio too, if you want to hear some of them in my voice. A lot about education, some pieces on art education and access to art, access to poetry, increasing access to poetry, which is something I'd like to work on because as a kid who didn't have access to the arts, that's become very important to me. So yeah, there's a lot there to get to know.
Fabulous. And we will put all that information, all your links, the website in the show notes. And so again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here with us. And I hope this is the beginning of many conversations we share together, because I completely, thoroughly enjoy
great.
you.
Thanks. Good to be part of the mosaic.
Right. It's my honor to have you, our honor to have you. Okay. Until soon.